His final illness. Acariya had already lived for 5 years at Ban Nong Peo Monastery when, in March of 1949, precisely on the 14th day of the 4th lunar month, his body began exhibiting signs indicating the approaching end of his life. By then, he was 79 years old. On that day, there appeared the first symptoms of an illness that was to worsen until it finally brought to a close his long life. A day that sent tremors through Acariya's body elements and shock waves through the community of his close disciples. Initially, there was a light fever, accompanied by a slight cough. But as the days passed, the symptoms steadily worsened, never showing the slightest improvement. Obviously abnormal, the constant decline in his health worried us all. But Acariya himself clearly knew that this was to be his final illness, an illness no type of medical treatment could cure. He informed his disciples of this from the very beginning, and from then on never showed any interest in medicines. On the contrary, he seemed annoyed when someone brought him medicines to take. This he expressed in no uncertain terms. "This is the illness of an old man who has reached the end of the line. No matter what kind of medicine I take, it will never be cured. All that's left is the breath in my body, biding its time, awaiting the day it finally ceases. I'm like a dead tree that's still standing. No matter how much you fertilize and water that tree, it is impossible to make it sprout and flower again. This old dead tree now stands anticipating the day it will topple over and go crashing to the ground, felled by this very same illness. I thoroughly investigated my condition long before the symptoms appeared. That is why I've been warning you all. Don't be complacent. Hurry up. Intensify your efforts now while I am still alive. In that way, I can help you to resolve any problems you may have in the meantime. Missing this opportunity now may cause you to waste a lot of time in the future. I will not be here much longer. Soon I shall depart this world, in keeping with the law of impermanence that follows constantly on the heels of all conditioned things without exception. 3 years ago, I warned you that I would not last more than 3 years. What more can I say? What I've told you I know to be inevitable. The work that the round of samsara performs inside the minds and bodies of human beings and animals alike continues unerringly along its natural course. In just a few months' time, it will complete its final task within this body of mine. How can it possibly alter its appointed task? With each passing day, his symptoms gradually worsened. Showing no interest in medicines of any kind, he was clearly annoyed when people came and urged him to try this remedy or that cure. But so many people arrived offering cures that he had a hard time resisting them all. Each one touted the effectiveness of the medicine he was offering, insisting that if he took it, he was sure to get better, for he had already cured many others. They all pleaded with him to try their medicines out of compassion for them. They wanted him to get better so he could continue to be of service to his many followers for a long time to come. He often warned them that medicines were useless for his illness, that only firewood for cremating the corpse was appropriate. But the more he protested, the more they beseeched him. So occasionally he yielded to their appeals and took a small dose of medicine. He was concerned that people would feel disappointed if they believed he had given up on his condition. As news of his illness spread across the region, people began arriving from all directions to visit him at Ban Nong Peo. Traveling from locations far and near in all kinds of weather, a steady flow of monks and laity poured in like the waters from a monsoon rain. Ban Nong Peo was situated in a valley surrounded by thick forest, some 12 to 15 miles from the main highway between Udon, Thani, and Nakorn. Though people had to travel by foot to see him, they appeared undaunted by the distance and the difficulties it posed. Only the elderly, unable to make the journey on foot, hired ox carts to take them there. By nature, Acariya always preferred to live alone quietly. Even the monks living with him were discouraged from bothering him unless absolutely necessary. Consequently, receiving large numbers of well-wishers disagreed with his natural inclination to remain aloof from such tiresome affairs. When sick, he had always been reluctant to allow even his close disciples to take care of him. Though he did make certain exceptions. When he did allow it, The monks attending to his personal needs had to be very circumspect in his presence. Only monks deemed trustworthy were selected for these duties. As his health deteriorated, a discerning senior monk was appointed to oversee all arrangements for his health care. Since by nature Acariya was very thorough and meticulous, this monk had to decide what action was appropriate in each instance, and then see that the other monks carefully followed this regimen. For this reason, monks attending on him were carefully chosen to ensure their behavior did not conflict with his subtle temperament. The lay people and the monks, arriving from various locations around the region with hopes of seeing him to pay their respects, were first asked to wait until an appropriate time could be arranged. When the monk handling these matters felt the time was right, he entered Acariya's hut to inform him about the visitors. Once permission was granted, the visitors were taken to see him. After Acariya had spoken to them for a while, they respectfully took their leave and departed. The monks at Ban Nong Peo Monastery had always arranged visits in this manner for those who came to see him. Visitors were invariably asked to wait until permission was granted, and then they were escorted to his hut in groups at the time which he had agreed to receive them. The exceptions to this rule were senior disciples, who enjoyed a special, close relationship with him, being acharyas in their own right. Once Acariya was informed of their arrival and had given his consent, the acharyas went straight in to converse with him in private. As the months passed, his condition continued to deteriorate. Although the symptoms never became very severe, he always felt unwell. His illness resembled an armed insurgency gradually escalating into a full-scale war, consuming everything in its path and leaving its victim decimated. His disciples were deeply affected. He occupied a special place at the center of their hearts, so his failing health left them all distraught. Feeling sad, even dejected, they were not so cheerful as before. Every conversation began with the topic of Acariya's illness and moved on to something else, only to return to his health again as the conversation ended. Despite failing health, Acariya did not neglect his teaching obligations. His compassionate concern for his disciples never diminished, though he was no longer able to expound the Dhamma in such detail as before. Having finished his talk, he briefly answered questions and then promptly adjourned the meeting to return to his hut for a rest. Incredibly, though, while sitting there expounding Dhamma to the assembled monks, he showed no signs of illness. He spoke with characteristic resoluteness in a sharp, lively fashion, his voice booming loudly, as if he never had been sick. When he wanted to emphasize a point, the tempo of his voice quickened dramatically to drive the point home. He held nothing back as he spoke. His whole demeanor belied his true condition. Only after he finished speaking did we all realize how exhausted he was, so we quickly adjourned to allow him a chance to rest. One evening, shortly before his illness began, on the occasion of Magha Puja, the full moon day of February 1949, Acariya began expounding Dhamma to the assembled monks at 8 p.m. and did not finish until midnight, speaking for a total of 4 hours. The power of the Dhamma he delivered that night truly amazed the whole assembly of Dhutanga monks who were gathered for that occasion. To those listening, the entire universe appeared to have vanished without a trace, replaced in their awareness by the flow of his all-encompassing Dhamma radiating forth in every direction. He began by paying tribute to the 1,250 arahants who had come together spontaneously on this full moon day in the time of the Buddha. On this day, 1,250 arahants assembled spontaneously at the Lord Buddha's residence without prior arrangement. They were all individuals of the utmost purity, completely free of kilesas. The Lord Buddha himself delivered the Patimokkha exhortation that day, making the occasion of his Sutti Uposatha, that is, an Uposatha observed among monks who are all absolutely pure. Compare that assembly with the one gathered here today. You listen to the Patimokkha being recited among monks who are all absolutely tainted. Not one of you is completely free of kilesas. It is dismaying to think that, having ordained as a monk, each of you is a son of the same Buddha as those Arahant disciples. Yet, in your case, it is just an empty claim lacking any real substance, like a person having the name Goodman, who, on the contrary, is so weighed down under his own evil doings he can hardly move. In the Buddha's day, monks practiced the Dhamma truly, and so became true monks with a true understanding that concealed nothing false. Today, the fame and celebrity of some monks is so great that they rival the sun and the moon, yet their actions sink to the depths of avijja. Where will they ever find virtue, truth, and purity? They merely accumulate a mass of kilesas and create the evil kamma that goes with them. Since monks today are not engaged in uprooting the kilesas from their hearts, how can visuddhyoposita possibly arise? Once ordained, they are satisfied with their exalted status as Buddhist monks, taking for granted that this makes them models of virtue. But they have no idea what the true virtues of a Buddhist monk really are. If they understood the meaning of the Bhakti-mukha exhortation that the Lord Buddha delivered, they would know the true nature of virtue. He condensed the essential meaning of virtue into this concise statement: refrain from all evil, develop goodness and wisdom in abundance, and purify the mind until it is bright and clear. This is the essence of the Buddha's teaching. Refraining from evil, what does it mean? Some people refrain from acting in evil ways, but still speak in evil ways. Others may not act or speak in evil ways, but still like to think in evil ways. They continue to amass evil within themselves from dawn to dusk. Waking up the next morning, they resume, amassing more evil. So it continues, day in and day out, and they are not interested in reflecting upon their actions. Convinced they are already virtuous people, they wait around expecting a state of purity to arise from virtue that exists in name only. So they never find a state of purity. Instead, they find only defilement and disquiet. This is bound to happen, for anyone intent on looking for trouble is sure to find it. What else would they find? There is no shortage of such things in the conventional world we live in. This was Acariya Mun's way of explaining the underlying natural principles of virtue to practicing monks, in the hope that they would gain a profound insight into the truth. He then went on to explain the way of practice that begins with samadhi and wisdom and ends with the ultimate attainment, absolute freedom. Discussing all areas of practice fully and openly, his exposition that day held nothing back. But, since much of what he said has already been covered in previous talks, I shall not elaborate any further here. The assembly of monks sat perfectly still the entire time he spoke, no one making the slightest sound to interrupt the cadence of his voice as he delivered this eloquent discourse. As he finished speaking, he made a similar remark to the one he previously made at Wat Luang Monastery in Chiang Mai. He said, in effect, that this talk would be the final encore of his old age. Never would he give another such talk. His words that night were prophetic, because from that day on, he never gave another profound and lengthy exposition of Dhamma. 1 month later, his illness began, and his health steadily declined until he finally passed away. Despite the physical difficulties he suffered as a result of that degenerative disease, he insisted on making the effort to walk to the village for alms round and continued eating only 1 meal a day from his alms bowl, as he always had. He did not simply abandon these practices. Eventually, when he felt that he could no longer walk the entire distance, he made an effort to walk at least halfway through the village before returning to the monastery. Seeing that so much walking caused him difficulty, lay supporters and senior monks conferred, and decided to invite him to walk only as far as the monastery gate, where offerings of food would be placed in his bowl. Had they requested him to abstain altogether from going on alms round, he would surely have demurred. So long as he was still physically able, he felt obliged to continue. So everyone had to respect his wishes. They wanted to avoid doing anything that might conflict with his resolute temperament. He continued walking to the front gate for alms until he became too weak to make it there and back. At that point, he began walking only as far as the refectory to collect alms. Only when he could no longer walk at all did he stop going for alms. Even then, he continued to eat just 1 meal a day, which he took in his alms bowl. The rest of us had to respect his wishes each time. We were all amazed at the endurance of this noble sage who, refusing to forsake his fighting spirit, conceded nothing to the kilesas. As for the rest of us, we would probably be so dispirited at the very first sign of sickness that someone would have to carry us to the refectory to eat. It is truly disgraceful, the kilesas always laughing at us as we lie hopelessly on their chopping block, waiting for them to shred us to pieces like so much raw meat. What a pathetic sight! Here we are, full-fledged human beings, willingly putting ourselves at the mercy of the kilesas. All of us who carry this shame on our conscience should stop and reflect on Acariya Mun's mode of practice. We can then adopt it to safeguard us in our struggle with these defilements. In that way, we will always remain faithful to our Buddhist principles, instead of just being the kilesas' whipping boys. Eventually, Acariya Mun's condition became so serious that the rest of us felt obliged to undertake certain precautions. We quietly arranged for groups of 3 or 4 monks to keep a vigil every night sitting beneath his hut. We arranged this ourselves without informing him, though he may have been intuitively aware of it. We were concerned he might forbid us to do it, reasoning that it was a burden on the monks and thus an unnecessary nuisance. Every night, small groups of monks took turns, sitting silently beneath his hut in continuous shifts that lasted until dawn. Each group stayed for several hours until it was replaced by the next. This routine was already well established by the beginning of the rainy season retreat that year. When it became obvious that his illness had become very debilitating, we conferred among ourselves and decided to request his permission for 2 monks to be allowed to sit in meditation on his veranda. With his consent, 2 monks were always seated on his veranda from then on, and 2 more were seated down below. Besides the regular shifts of monks who kept watch on him, others were quietly overseeing the whole arrangement throughout the night. The end of the rains retreat saw an increasing number of senior disciples begin arriving from their own retreat locations to pay him their respects and help look after his needs. By that time his condition was critical and becoming more and more unstable by the day. Eventually, he called all his disciples together one day to remind them of the proper way to handle his impending death. "My illness has now reached its final stage. It is time to think about what will happen when I die. Preparations must be made in time. As I've told you many times, I am going to die. This much is certain. My death is destined to be a major event affecting not only the general public, but animals as well. I want you to know that I do not wish to die here at Ban Nong Peo. If I die here, it will be necessary to slaughter large numbers of farm animals in order to feed all the people coming to my funeral. I am only one dying person, but the death of this one person will in turn cause the deaths of a great many animals. Crowds of people will travel here to attend my funeral, but there's no market in this village where foodstuffs can be purchased. Since ordaining as a monk, I have never for a moment considered doing harm to any animal, to say nothing of killing them. Compassion has always been the foundation of my conscious existence. I am continuously extending the spirit of loving kindness and dedicating the fruits of my merit to all living beings without exception. I do not want to see any animal lose the life it cherishes so dearly. I could never countenance having my own death become a source of enmity between myself and the world's animals. I want you to take me to Zakon Nakorn, so I can die there. That town has a large marketplace, so my death should not affect the lives of so many animals. I have yet to die, but monks and lay people are already arriving here in a steady stream, their numbers increasing each day, clear evidence of the scale of the problem. Now think of how many people will come when I finally do die. Many people will mourn my death, but that is not my concern. I am ready for death, whenever and wherever it happens. I have no regrets about parting with my body. Having already investigated it thoroughly, I know that it is merely a combination of elements that have joined together temporarily, only to break apart again and revert back to their original elemental nature. What is there to be attached to? What I am concerned about is safeguarding the local farm animals so they won't have to perish as well. I don't want to see animal carcasses laid out for sale all up and down the roadsides here. That would be extremely regrettable. Fortunately, it's not too late to remedy the situation. I am asking that you arrange for my departure as soon as possible, for the sake of all those animals that would otherwise die as a result of my death. It is my express wish that their lives be protected. Does anyone have anything to say? If so, speak up now. Not a single person in the group spoke up. An atmosphere of quiet despair pervaded the assembly. As the Buddha said, Yampitsang nalapatitampi dukkhang. Not getting what one wants is truly a form of dukkha. Everyone realized that whether he went to Sakon Nakhon or remained here at Ban Nong Peo, in either case the situation was hopeless. He was going to die. So the meeting remained silent. There was just no way to resolve this dilemma. In the end, everyone willingly agreed to his request. Prior to the meeting, the residents of Ban Nong Peo village had made it known that they would feel honored to have him die there. We will manage all the funeral arrangements ourselves. We may be quite poor here, but our hearts are rich in faith and respect for Acariya Man. We will do everything we possibly can to arrange the funeral here. We won't let anyone look down on us saying that the villagers of Ban Nong Peo couldn't cremate the body of even one Acharya. Instead, it had to be done elsewhere. We don't want that kind of reputation. Whatever happens, all of us here are ready to offer ourselves to Acariya Man, body and soul. He will remain our cherished refuge until the day he dies. We can't allow anyone to take him away. We will resist to the last breath any attempt to do so. So, when hearing Acharya Man's explanation for being taken away, their disappointment was palpable, but they felt they couldn't object. Although they venerated him so much, their sadness and disappointment at hearing his reasons nearly broke their hearts. They were forced to accept his decision. They truly deserve a lot of sympathy. Their willingness to sacrifice everything in their devotion to Acharya Man is a gesture I will always treasure. I'm sure that all of my readers feel the same way. Many of Acharya Man's most senior disciples attended the meeting, aware as he spoke that he must be moved as soon as possible. After he had announced his decision and stated his reasons, and there being no dissenting voices, the monks and laity who were present all agreed to construct a stretcher suitable to carry him on the long journey from Ban Nong Peo to Sakon Nakhon. The next day, a large crowd of lay supporters and monks brought the stretcher to his hut, awaiting his departure. An immense sorrow overcame everyone that day. They realized they were about to lose somebody whom they so deeply cherished and revered. It was a sorrow so great that local people and monks alike could barely contain their emotions. After the morning meal was over, and everyone awaited in readiness for the journey to start, emotions began to run high in the crowd surrounding his hut as the local people, gathered to see him off, gave vent to their despair one last time. Many monks and novices swelled the crowd. They too felt the strain. The deep sadness depressing their hearts slowly welled up, and tears flowed quietly, dampening their cheeks. At that moment, Acharya Man appeared, carried by a group of his senior disciples, a moment of further heightened emotion. As the monks carried him down the steps and placed him on the stretcher, the mixture of affection, respect, and despair that everyone had kept bottled up inside freely poured out. Men, women, monks, and novices were no longer able to hold back their flood of tears. Onlookers wept openly, expressing an unrestrained and deep sense of sorrow. I myself could not avoid getting caught up in the despondent mood pervading that sad occasion, despite the fact that I was accompanying Acharya Man when he left. The air filled with sounds of weeping and crying. People called out, begging Acharya Man, "Please get better. Don't pass away from this world, leaving us forever in unbearable sadness." They were almost inconsolable at that point. In his great compassion, he sympathized with how poor their community was. This they knew, yet they couldn't help but feel terribly miserable watching the cherished treasure over whom they had faithfully kept watch for so many years slip away from them forever. He was departing now, and there was nothing they could do to prevent it. As Acharya Man was carried past, the sounds of their heartfelt laments surged along the path, a tidal wave of grief inundating the hearts of those who lined the route. As he passed by, everything appeared grey and bleak, as though their lives had suddenly been snuffed out. Even the grasses and trees, though insensible to the unfolding scene before them, appeared to wither up and die in response. As Acharya Man left the peaceful shade of the forest sanctuary where he and his disciples had lived so contentedly, a place where so many ordinary people had come to find shelter over the years, the monastery suddenly felt deserted, even though many monks still remained. Suddenly it no longer had that enormous tree with the thick, broad foliage that had always given so much peace and comfort to all who came to shelter there. The heart-rending, anguished cries of those wanting to offer their undying devotion to the sasana was an immensely sad, forlorn sound indeed. They were witnessing the departure of the one man who embodied the high ideals of their unshakable religious faith. Long after the procession had passed through the village and the sounds of inconsolable grief had faded into the distance, hundreds of monks and lay people continued to walk behind his stretcher, their long, drawn faces mirroring the somber, cheerless spirit of the occasion. Walking along in complete silence, like mourners in a funeral procession of a close friend or relative, they did their best to come to terms with the heartbreak. No one spoke a word, but in their hearts they pondered long and deeply on their shattered hopes, the overwhelming feeling being that all was now lost. It seemed then as if we were taking his corpse away to dispose of it, even though he was still very much alive. The realization that all hope was now gone, that he would never return again, had fully sunk in. The more we thought about it, the sadder we became. Yet we couldn't stop thinking about it. We all walked along in a kind of melancholy daze, contemplating thoughts of despair. I must confess to being shamefully inadequate in this regard. The whole journey I thought only of how I was about to lose my one true refuge in life. No longer would there be someone to rely on when questions arose in my practice, as they so often did. The distance from Ban Nong Peo to the district seat of Panna Nikom was approximately 15 miles, but the long hours of walking passed almost unnoticed. Walking behind him, knowing he was dying, I thought only of how much I was going to miss my teacher. I desperately wanted him to continue living at the time. His final days corresponded to a crucial stage in my own meditation practice, a time when I had many unresolved problems to work out. No matter how much I pondered this predicament, I always arrived at the same conclusion. My dependence on him would have to be terminated soon. This made the future look bleak. His condition remained calm and stable throughout the long journey. He did not display any obvious signs of ill health. In fact, he appeared to be lying fast asleep, though of course he wasn't sleeping at all. Around midday, the procession reached a cool, shady grove of trees. We asked Acariya Mun's permission to take a short rest for the sake of the large group of people accompanying him. He immediately asked, "Where are we now?" The moment I heard his voice, I was caught off guard by a surge of affection and emotional attachment. Why was I so deeply moved by this wonderful, welcome sound? It seemed, suddenly, as though Acariya Mun was his old self again. Is this beloved paragon of the three worlds truly going to abandon me, a poor orphan whose heart is about to break? Will his pure heart, whose kind assistance has always helped to breathe life into my spirit, really withdraw from my life and disappear? Forever? Such were my immediate feelings the moment Acariya Mun spoke up. Some people may consider this a somewhat crazy reaction, but I have no misgivings. I willingly admit this kind of craziness. For Acariya Mun's sake, I was so crazy I would gladly have volunteered to die in his place without the least concern for my own life. Had it been his wish, I would have happily laid down my life. No second thoughts. I was prepared at a moment's notice to sacrifice my life for his. But alas, it was impossible for him to accept any sacrifice I might be willing to offer. The truth is that everyone in the world must inevitably travel the same route. Whatever is born must die. There are no exceptions. The journey to Sakon Nakhon was planned in 2 stages. The first day, we walked as far as Ban Pu Monastery in Panna Nikom district, where we were to rest for a few days, allowing Acariya Mun a chance to recuperate before moving on to Sakon Nakhon. Leaving Ban Nong Peo at 9 o'clock that morning, the procession eventually reached Ban Pu Monastery shortly before dark. The journey had taken all day because we followed the more circuitous route, skirting the edge of the mountains, to make it easier for him and the many elderly men and women determined to follow him all the way. Upon arriving, we invited him to rest in a low pavilion where his needs could easily be attended. It was also a convenient place for monks and lay people to pay him their respects. Acariya Mun's sojourn at Ban Pu Monastery dragged on for many days, his condition steadily worsening the entire time. Meanwhile, each new day brought visiting crowds of monks and lay people from the surrounding area. Some even came at night. All were eager for a chance to meet him and pay their respects. Though well aware of his illustrious reputation, most of them had never made his acquaintance. They had heard the news that he was certainly a modern-day arahant who would soon pass away into Nibbana. It was rumored that those who met him would be blessed with good fortune, while those that didn't would have lived their lives in vain. So they were all anxious to benefit by coming to pay him homage. They did not want to feel they had wasted their birth as human beings. The very first morning after arriving at Banpu, Acharya Man demanded to know when he would be taken to Sakon Nakhon. He told his disciples that it was not his intention to die at Banpu. They must take him on to Sakon Nakhon without further delay. His senior disciples replied that they planned to wait for a short while for him to recuperate. Then they would proceed to Sakon Nakhon as he requested. So Acharya Man let them have a drop for a while. The next day he again asked the same question. His senior disciples repeated their reasons and he remained silent, only to bring it up again later. Time and again he demanded to know when they would take him to Sakon Nakhon. He said that, by waiting too long, he would fail to make it in time. In the end, they asked him to extend his stay at Banpu Monastery for a full 10 days. By the time 4 or 5 days had passed, he was pressing them constantly to take him to Sakon Nakhon. Each time, his senior disciples either kept silent or repeated their previous justifications for staying. Repeatedly he pressed them, scolding them for waiting so long. "Are you going to have me die here? I've told you from the very beginning, I am going to die in Sakon Nakhon. My time is almost up. Get me there in a hurry. Don't wait so long." During the final 3 days, his demands to be taken to Sakon Nakhon became increasingly vociferous. During his last night there, he flatly refused to lie down and sleep. Instead, he urgently called the monks to his bedside and told them unequivocally that he could not remain alive much longer. He insisted on being taken that very night to be sure of arriving in time. He then had us prop him up, sitting cross-legged in samadhi and facing in the direction of Sakon Nakhon. As soon as he withdrew from samadhi, he told us to prepare to leave. He was waiting no longer. We rushed off to call his senior disciples. They informed him that he would definitely be taken to Sakon Nakhon the next morning. Following this assurance, his sense of urgency lessened somewhat, but he still refused to go to sleep, speaking openly about how he felt. "My time is almost up. I cannot hang on much longer. It would be better to leave tonight. In that way, I will be sure to arrive in time for that critical moment which is now fast approaching. I have no wish to shoulder the burden of this flaming mass of body elements any longer. I want to discard the body once and for all, so that I needn't be concerned with this great pile of pain and suffering ever again. I am literally on the verge of death right now. Don't you monks realize that I could die at any minute? My body is completely useless now. There is no justifiable reason to keep me in this state of physical torment. All of you understand my reasons for going to Sakon Nakhon. That's why we came here in the first place. So why do you still insist on delaying my departure? Is this Sakon Nakhon? Why don't you take me there immediately? I want to go, right now. What are you waiting for? What use is a corpse? It's not useful for anything. Not even for making fish sauce. I have already told you, my body has reached its limit. It simply cannot last any longer. Isn't anyone here interested in listening to me and doing what I say? I have explicitly stated what I want you to do. Still, no one seems to listen. If you insist on adopting such an attitude, how will you ever discover the truth? If here in my presence, while I'm alive, you are so stubborn, refusing to believe what I say, how will you ever manage to be good, reasonable people once I'm dead? I know what I told you to be absolutely true. I have explained the whole situation to you in a carefully considered, reasonable manner, yet you stubbornly refuse to comply. I am beginning to lose hope that any of you will develop the principles of sound judgment needed to uphold the sasana." Acharya Man was very adamant the last night at Banpu. He absolutely refused to sleep that whole night. I suspect he was afraid that, in his condition, he might never wake up again. At the time, none of us there with him could figure out his reason for staying awake all night. Only later did the real reason occur to me. At 7 o'clock the next morning, several trucks from the Provincial Highway Department arrived to escort Acharya Man to Sakon Nakhon. Mrs. Num Chuanon, as head of the escort, invited him to ride in one of the vehicles. He readily agreed, and asked only whether there were enough vehicles to carry all of the many monks who were scheduled to accompany him. He was informed that 3 trucks had come. If these were not sufficient to transport all the monks who wanted to go, A return trip would be made to pick up the rest. Understanding the arrangement, Acariya remained silent. After the monks had eaten their meal, a doctor injected him with a sedative so that he would not be disturbed by the bumpy ride. In those days, the roads were quite rough, full of potholes and in generally poor condition. Having received the injection, he was placed on a stretcher and carried out to one of the trucks parked at the edge of the field, there being no road into the monastery. Soon after, he began to fall asleep. The convoy of vehicles then began the trip to Sakon Nakhon, arriving there at exactly noon. Upon arrival, he was carried down from the truck and placed, still sleeping, in a hut at Wat Suttawat Monastery. He remained asleep the entire day, not waking until about midnight. Within an hour of his waking, those critical symptoms, of which he had repeatedly forewarned his seemingly deaf and blind disciples, became more and more apparent, as if to say to us all, "Now do you see? This is why I kept insisting that you hurry to bring me to Sakon Nakhon. I want to quickly rid myself of this messy heap of suffering. The symptoms are fully obvious now. If you still don't understand, then take a look. If you still don't believe what I was telling you, then watch carefully and consider with all your heart what you see appearing before you at this moment. Was I telling you the truth or not? Stop being so deaf, blind, and thoughtless from now on. Otherwise, you will never find the wisdom needed to save yourselves. What you are witnessing right now should inspire you to think deeply, so don't be complacent." Para Have Pancha Kantha. The 5 kantas are indeed a heavy burden. In the very early hours of the morning, he began to take leave of this heavy burden, this heap of intense suffering that no truly wise person wants to encounter again in the future. The monastery was absolutely quiet that night. No one milled about to disturb the stillness. Shortly, some important acharyas, like Chao Kun Thammachedi from Wat Pa Baan Monastery in Udon, Thani, arrived at his hut, having come in great haste as soon as they heard the news. As they entered, they hurriedly sat down in a calm, composed manner, though their hearts were actually troubled by the obvious deterioration in his condition. It was a poignant reminder that he could pass away at any moment. Monks arriving to monitor his condition sat silently in 3 rows facing him. Important senior disciples, led by Chao Kun Thammachedi, sat in the front, the more junior monks and novices filling the remaining rows. All sat in complete silence, their eyes fixed on Acariya. Their lower eyelids were moistened by tears they couldn't hold back. Such was the intensity of their despair. They knew all hope was lost, for nothing at all could be done to change the inevitable. They felt as if their own lives were losing all meaning. At the beginning, Acariya was lying on his right side in the lion's posture. Fearing this might exhaust him, some monks gently removed the pillow supporting him so that he came to rest lying on his back. As soon as he became aware of this, he tried to shift back to his right side, but he no longer had the strength to move. As he struggled to turn on his side, some senior acharyas attempted to reposition the pillow so that it again supported his back. But noticing how very weak he was, they decided to stop, fearing that it might just make matters worse. Consequently, when Acariya finally passed away, he was lying neither on his back nor on his right side, but slightly propped up somewhere in between. It was simply impossible to adjust his posture further under the circumstances. His disciples, mostly monks and novices with a few lay people, sat in total despair as life slowly ebbed from his body. So apprehensive were they about his imminent death, they had almost forgotten to breathe. As the minutes passed, his breathing gradually became softer and more refined. No one took their eyes off him, for it was obvious the end was fast approaching. His breathing continued to grow weaker and weaker until it was barely discernible. A few seconds later it appeared to cease, but it ended so delicately that no one present could determine just when he passed away. His physical appearance revealed nothing abnormal, so different from the death of the ordinary person. Despite the fact that all his disciples observed his final moments with unblinking attention, not one of them was able to say with any conviction, that was precisely the moment when Acariya finally took leave of this dismal world. Seeing no apparent signs of life, Chow Kun Tammachedi rather tentatively said, "I think he's passed away." At the same time, he glanced down at his watch. It was exactly 2:23 a.m., so that was taken as the time of death. When death had been confirmed, the impact of his passing was reflected in the grief-stricken, tearful faces of all the monks who sat crowded around the lifeless body. There followed an anguished few moments of low coughs and soft, incoherent mutterings, before the whole room sank into a mood of silent despair which is beyond the power of words to describe. Our hearts were plunged into unbearable feelings of emptiness. Our bodies sitting there appeared to be mere empty shells. Several long moments of stilled silence ensued, when the whole world appeared to cease momentarily, while Acariya Mun abandoned his conventional existence and entered into the domain of ultimate happiness, where no vestige of conventional reality could disturb him ever again. I myself very nearly died of a broken heart along with him, as I sat by his side steeped in pensive sorrow. I could not manage to shake off the gloomy, somber mood that clouded my heart as he departed the world. I could do nothing to alleviate the extreme pain of the loss I felt. Living dead fittingly describes my sense of hopelessness at that moment. After a period of silence, his senior disciples had the monks neatly rearrange his bedding. They laid out his body there for the time being, with the understanding that next morning they would consult together about making further arrangements. This accomplished, the monks began filing out of his room. Though a few remained on the veranda outside the room, most of them went down below. Even though the whole area surrounding the hut was illuminated by brightly lit lanterns, his disciples stumbled around blindly in dejection, unsure where they were going. Appearing somnolent, almost drugged, they wandered aimlessly back and forth. Several monks actually fainted at the time, as though they too were about to expire because life no longer held any meaning for them. The entire monastic community found itself in a chaotic state of confusion late that night. All were inconsolable over the terrible sense of loss they suffered. Monks milled around absent-mindedly, having no clear idea where they were going or why. Such was the power of utter despondency arising from the departure of that shining beacon which so illuminated their lives and brightened their hearts. Suddenly, all sense of comfort and security had evaporated, exposing them to the uncertainty of living on without a reliable refuge. This cold, dark constriction in their hearts left them feeling that nothing substantial remained in the entire universe, nothing they could hold to for support. Failing to consider that beings throughout the universe have always managed to find a source of refuge, at that moment they appeared to face a bleak and uncertain future, as if dire misfortune were engulfing them all. Acariya Mun had been the one true refuge. To him they could always confidently entrust themselves, heart and soul, without reservation. I mean no disregard to the Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha, but at that moment they seemed somehow very distant, making it difficult to re-establish them as a viable refuge. They did not appear to project the same affirmative presence that Acariya Mun did. He was always close at hand and ready to help resolve our doubts and provide us with inspiration. Approaching him with pressing problems that we were unable to solve on our own, these same burning issues invariably dissolved away the moment he offered a solution. This salient recollection, so deeply engraved on my heart, profoundly affected me when he passed away. I could think of no other person capable of helping me solve my problems. Who else could I find with such compassion for me? Who else's advice could I trust? I was afraid of being left alone, depressed and hopelessly stuck with my own store of ignorance. Gone were the easy solutions I had found while living with him. The more I thought about this dilemma, the more discouraged I became about finding a safe, painless way out on my own. In my ignorance, I saw no way forward at that moment. Only misery and despair stared me in the face. Sitting there in front of his dead body, as though I myself were dead, I could think of no way to save myself and relieve my misery. I sat brooding, a living, breathing ghost, completely oblivious to time or bodily fatigue. This was the first time in my life as a monk that I felt so gloomy, frightened, and confused, and there was no one to help me, no means of extricating myself from this distress. Each time I glanced down at Acariya Mun's still, lifeless body, tears welled up in my eyes and flowed down my cheeks. I was helpless to stop them. My chest heaved and sobbed as an uncontrollable emotion arose and lodged in my throat, nearly suffocating me. Eventually I regained enough presence of mind to reflect inwardly, admonishing myself. Do I really intend to die of a broken heart right now? He died free of concerns and attachments, which are matters of the kilesas. If I were to die now, I would die as a result of my concerns and attachments. That would be harmful to me. Neither my despondency nor my death is of any use to me or to Acariya Mun. When he was alive, he never taught us to miss him to the point of death. This kind of longing is the way of worldly people everywhere. Even though my reason for missing him is associated with Dhamma, it is still contaminated by worldly concerns, and thus hardly worthy of a Buddhist monk. Such thoughts are especially inappropriate for someone like me, who has set his sights firmly on achieving the highest level of Dhamma. The Lord Buddha stated that whoever practices the Dhamma properly is, in fact, worshipping the Buddha, that whoever realizes the Dhamma realizes the Buddha as well. It is clear that my longing is not in perfect accord with Dhamma. To be in perfect accord with Dhamma, I must practice precisely what Acariya Mun taught me. This is the correct way for me to show how much I miss him. Should I die while engaged in those harsh training methods that he recommended, I shall feel confident that my death is in harmony with the principles of Dhamma. This is the only sensible way to behave. I must not obstruct my own progress by longing for him in an unreasonable, worldly manner. I'll only harm myself. In this way I regained mindfulness, allowing reason a chance to intervene and forestall the maelstrom raging in my heart at the time. And so I avoided being buried alive in my own futility.